Don't overthink it, it's just paint. Welcome back to another episode of Paint Society. My name is Brian, and we are here on episode 2 of our full complete paint job. Now, if you missed it on episode 1, we took in the car and we fixed some of the damage to the front end, and then we completely took everything off the car and prepared this car for a full paint job to do it the correct way. Once that was done, we gave it a full wash, and then we inspect the rest of the car to make sure that we got all of the visible dings labeled, and then we removed all of that double-sided tape to prepare it. And that's exactly where we are right now in episode 2, where we're going to start to prepare the paint for primer. Now in this episode, we'll really dial in on getting that faded paint all smoothed out and primered up. And in the following episodes, we'll get more into body work, but let's take a look at our sun-burnt panels right now. And this is what we are working with. If we take a look, there's just a little bit of clear coat still left on the hood. All of this is the original base coat underneath, and this discolorment is more of the faded base coat. All right, so what we're going to show you is how to prepare it so that fadedness goes onto the top of the fender, and then it's really prevalent on the whole entire roof. We can see over in this area more of that extremely faded base carrying on over to the back end. We really only have just a touch of clear coat that was underneath our molding. Now same here on the top of the B pillar, we have that same faded clear coat. The paint is completely dead. And over here on the trunk, it's the same thing, except for where the paint was underneath the spoiler. It's in still pretty good shape. So let's talk about what is happening here. If we take a look at what's happening here, we can see that the top clear is starting to peel. However, the actual paint and the primers underneath are still completely intact, which is a very good sign, meaning that we don't need to take it down to complete metal. In fact, all the panels look just as good in that regard, except for one area. We can see here some bubbling of the primer, which comes from underneath. The primer coat has some sort of corrosion possibly, or what it might be, we don't know, but we will be sanding this down. We can see more of that bubbling or pitting or chipping. So we'll get down to that right here. Now, if you see anything like this on your vehicle, you need to get underneath it. You can't just smooth it out. So you really need to know what you're dealing with. If you're concerned and you don't know, it doesn't hurt to take it down a little bit further. You see, not every paint job needs to go down to complete metal. If this is a restoration job and it's got a lot of body work and multiple paint jobs, then that's my suggestion. But here, we have no evidence of cracking from underneath the paint. So all we're gonna need to do is to feather and sand off that dead top layer, and then give it a direct to metal primer, and then do our body work from there. So right now what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna be starting on the trunk. I'm gonna start with the least aggressive sandpaper. We're gonna be using 180 grit first. And we're gonna be using a orbital flat sander because we wanna make sure what we're doing is completely flat. We never wanna dig into the surface, but we wanna keep it nice and even. I have 180 grit on this sander, and what we'll do is pretty much feather the clear coat and the old paint and smooth it out. It's very important to understand what is going on here. Okay, so we've got clear coat, we've got base coat, we've got primer, and maybe like an E-coat and then metal. Now this is actually sanded evenly because we're using a flat surface. So what we have here is we can see that even though our clear coat is pretty burnt out, it's still doing a very fine job of feathering. And we want our rings to be about 1/4 of an inch. See how this is 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch? You don't want them too fine or too close together, or else you get something we call edge mapping. And edge mapping is after you spray the primer on there, you'll see like a ring around it. And that can be a few other causes as well that we'll get into later. So basically what we're going to be doing is using our 180 grit on the whole entire surface, and we just want to feather the old and the new together. And when we put that primer on it, it will lock it down. After all that 180 sanding, we can see we got some metal and we have some different layers of paint. Now, if this was a true restoration completely, then we would take it all down to metal, and obviously that would cost a lot more. But since our paint is still technically good and not cracking from underneath, then we can put some primer on this to lock it down. I'm not ready to prime this yet, but my metal is exposed, okay? And when my metal is exposed, it can rust. I still want to work on my roof, and I still want to work on my hood, getting that sanded down and all the burnt areas on the car before I do body work. So what I'm going to use is some self-etching primer in the meantime to protect this rust while I work on the other parts of the vehicle. And after all of that sanding, we are good to go. Now, every single paint job tells a story, and every panel tells a story. And we can see we have two layers here. We have the original dark black, and then the primer, and then we have like a sealer, then we'll have the OEM color right there, and then we have a repaint. So we have everything feathered out, and although it does kind of look spotty, it's all even. Now we're going to attack the roof. And after we got everything sanded down, this is what it looks like. Now on the roof, what we went ahead and did, since the paint was a little bit more beat up, is we removed all of the clear coat that is on the actual roof. So you won't see any of the haziness from that clear coat because that clear coat is completely removed. Now we have a new set of issues right here. If you look closely, we've got these little pits, and what we noticed is bubbling from the beginning of our first episode. We wanted to find out what this bubbling was, and it actually is rust. So moisture has gotten underneath this. So what do we need to do from here? Well, from this point, I would say where our bubbling started, we need to take this whole entire area down to metal. Even if it's not bubbling, I don't trust it because we still got some little rust areas. And then we'll go ahead and get this in a direct to metal primer, protect it, and then from there we can start to see exactly why there was filler on this panel. And moving across to the other side, the driver's side, we're going to be using a 320 grit because it is not as bad. We have the MaxFilm where we're using for the whole project, and you can see right here, we just need to feather out this edge. We have Scorpion Paint here. He's helping us out with the project today. And basically go ahead and show us what you're going to be doing. So basically we're going to be taking that old paint and we're going to be, feathering it out. So if you look at it closer, right, this is the dead paint, and we can see that the clear is feathered out into the existing paint. So basically what we're going to be doing here is just working the tops of the door. The rest of the paint on the vehicle is actually in good condition. We want to seal it up with primer once we're done. So go ahead, Pedro, finish this one off. And now moving to the other side, we determined that, hey, there's rust underneath the fillers. I don't even know the reason why there is filler here because the metal seems good, but what we're gonna be using for this one is Pedro's gonna be using the SCT, the contours tool from Eastwood. And I really like it for this because how easy it is to really take the paint off. So let's go ahead and show us how it works a little bit. All right, and Pedro just finishing up with the last part here. You can see we completely took it off the metal, and for whatever reason, once again, there was filler from here to there, and it didn't need that. I mean, there's about a handful of tiny dents that just need a swipe of filler here and there, but this is all good metal. So, you know, for whatever reason, it was there. There's no need to pull the metal because it's such a tiny little dent. You can just use some glazing putty. Now we still need to get this little edge here and of course the transition here. So we're gonna use our 180 grit now, and we'll feather and smooth this out on the rest of the edges. And you can see the transition here. See how we really feathered it out so it's not an abrupt stop. And this is going to help when we go to primer it. So go ahead and finish up the rest of it now. And once we got the metal all done, then we went over it with just a little bit of filler. I mean, these dents were so small. There's two ways to do this. You can do it over metal or you can do it over epoxy. If it's a restoration job that you're not going to be able to get to the filler too soon, then you can put your epoxy down and then you can do your body work. Or you can do it like this if it's super small. Now, we still might need to do a little bit of filler work over this, but you know, you could do it either way. This is kind of like a last minute decision that Pedro and we decided it's probably be the best way to do it before we primer it. So what we're going to be doing here is the quarter is still in good condition, all right? But we want to make sure that we put primer over it. So I'm going to use a 180 grit, sand down the whole thing since our dents are already taken care of. We don't have to worry about doing any body work. So what we're going to be doing here for the purpose of the series and the episode is we're going to attack all of our dead paint in one episode, right? So the hood, the roof, the pillars here, the trunk. And then we're going to primer to about here. And then we're going to attack our body work. So we have the door, the trunk, and the fender, and then we'll finish it up. We'll prime the rest of the vehicle. And on this side, the paint is in much better condition, so we'll take it down only with a 320 grit. The other side was much more, you know, rougher, so we wanted to use 180. So Pedro will hit up 320, and then we'll prime this whole quarter panel as well. What you're seeing right now is Pedro just going over the little fine details. You see, if we don't sand this stuff, then it can peel. Now, he's using a maroon scuff pad. Let me see what you got going on. A maroon scuff pad. He uses that, and he also has, what is that, 320? A 320 grit. And that is a good grit before primer. It's not too fine. And you can see, you got to work all these edges. You don't want to leave any of these moldings on. That is where paint is going to peel first if you tape it off. So just moving it around the car, we're getting ourselves really set up here to get a nice primer job on there. And the reason why we're primering this once again is first, we're going to get all the dead paint taken care of. We're going to block it out, and I'm sure once we do the Bondo and the filler on some of the dents, there's going to be areas where we need to come back and reprime some of these areas. So at least let's get a coat of primer on it, and then if we need to go assess a little bit more down the road, we will. just like that, we got it all masked up. A lot of masking because there's a lot of primer. Now over here, since we're just doing the top, we rolled the edge. You never, ever, ever want a primer up to that edge. So we're gonna keep the primer probably around here. So just make sure that you learn from this, never primer up to a tape edge ever. We have foam in there. We're gonna show you now how to clean it off before you apply your primer, and then we'll talk about what primer you guys need to use on here. And you're gonna wanna use a wax and grease remover, and I'll link everything we use in the description. This is gonna get the rest of that dirt up and any silicone that might still be in the surface. We put it into a pump sprayer, and we have some clean lint-free towels, and we'll use to get this whole thing all cleaned up. So we're ready for our primering stage. Now there's a few ways to attack the metal. Now since this is just a overall paint job and not a restoration, we're not going to use epoxy. You would use epoxy, but then epoxy is kind of hard to sand down. So you would use epoxy if you had a restoration, then you would scuff it up and put a urethane surfacer. Or you can use an etching primer. Now the etching primer is just for any metal surfaces. So I'll go around with the etching primer and I'll use that. Or you can use a corrosion wipe. That is the easiest by far, just a little bit more pricey, and you would use the wipe to just go over any of the metal surfaces. It will coat the metal, protect it, and then you can put your urethane surface or primer. Right now, we're just gonna use this over our metal surfaces, and you don't need to use a lot. You just need to get it on there, and that will protect our metal. I'll probably do a couple coats on here around the car. Then we'll look around the car. If we see any exposed metal, we'll just give it one of those. Same thing over here. Hold on this edge. Over on the hood, we'll see if it's metal. It is metal. And basically we'll finish up going around the rest of the car, and then now I'll show you how to mix up this urethane surfacer. So now it's time for the primer. Now there's a few different primers, but these are the two that you would probably use. Now this is direct to metal DTM, and what that means is now we wouldn't have to use the etching primer. It will go directly onto the metal. Now we could use this, but it's not the same brand, so we're not going to use it. It's not the same brand as our paint system, and you want to try to stick with the same primers, the same base coats, and the same clear coats, so you have no compatibility issues. So that's why we're going to be using a Lessenol primer, and that's within the same brand as what we spray here. Now this mixes up 3 to 1 to 1. That means 3 parts of the primer, 1 part of the hardener, and then we'll add some reducer into it to help it flow out. So this should be enough. We'll add our hardener right now and our reducer. Now we're going to mix that up, and we're going to use a 1.8 tip. That should be thick enough to spray down the primer. just nailed down one coat of primer. You can see how we kept it completely away from that edge. Now this is flashed off. You want to make sure that it is completely flashed off, like meaning when we go to touch it, it's not completely cured, right? But it's dry enough that you're not going to pick up any primer. If you try to stack your coats on it, that's going to be problems. You're going to get a lot of issues. You'll get some lifting, adhesion issues, especially when you have multiple layers of paint like we have here. You might get a ring around your paint because the solvents can go right into that. So what Pedro's going to do now is going to lay down, we're going to put a total of 3 coats of primer on here because we really want to do a lot of blocking out. So let's get that rolling. Three coats of primer down. This thing is looking a lot better in one color. So what you're going to want to do, if you have time, is allow your primer to really dry. If you can, give it a few days. Allow everything to shrink, because what shrinking means is the primer is drying and getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and you want all the shrinking to be done before the paint job. Now when I primered this hood, I could identify a couple small little dents here and there, very small waves. So in the next episode, we'll focus on doing the body work to the multiple areas on the car, and we'll address different areas as well as on the A-pillar here. We still have a little bit of a waviness where those little dents were, so we'll smooth those out as well. But overall, it's looking really good, and it's nice to see all of that dead paint off of the car. And that's going to conclude today's video and this episode on preparing old paint and getting everything in primer. Now what you're going to see on the next episode is we're going to go around and fix minor dents here on a fender. We have some repair on the door and the trunk lid. That is the final remaining areas that we're going to spread out some Bondo, and we'll show you how to do some sanding and then get those areas back in primer. So make sure you catch that episode as well. Guys, this is Brian from Paint Society reminding you, don't overthink it, it's just paint. I'll see you guys on the next one.